The old clock in our hallway had been ticking for nearly 50 years. Every night before bed, I wound it carefully, just as my father had taught me. Its soft, steady rhythm had become the heartbeat of our little farmhouse outside Maple Creek, where my wife, Eleanor, and I had spent the last 33 years growing old together. At 78, my hands weren't as steady as they used to be. Arthritis made every movement slow, but I still insisted on locking every door and checking every window before going to sleep. Eleanor always smiled when she watched me. "You've checked that back door 3 times already, Thomas," she teased one chilly October evening. "I know," I laughed, "but an old man needs a hobby." She shook her head, kissed my cheek, and turned off the kitchen light. Life had become wonderfully predictable. Morning coffee on the porch, crossword puzzles after breakfast, a walk around the apple trees every afternoon, tea together before bed. We had buried our dreams years ago along with the people we loved, and somehow that quiet life had become enough, at least, until the phone started ringing. The first call came on a Tuesday. I woke suddenly. The darkness around me felt heavier than usual. Then I heard it. Ring, ring, ring. I reached toward the bedside clock. 2:17 a.m. Who on earth calls at this hour? Eleanor murmured, still half asleep, "I'll get it." The phone sat in the hallway beside the old grandfather clock. Its shrill ringing echoed to the silent house. I picked up. "Hello." Silence. Then a woman's voice. Soft, almost trembling. She whispered only 4 words. "He was innocent, Thomas." Click. The line went dead. I stood frozen. My heart pounded harder than it had in years. How did she know my name? I slowly returned to the bedroom. "Who was it?" Eleanor asked. "Wrong number." The lie came too quickly. She looked at me for a long moment but said nothing. Neither of us slept again that night. The next evening, I convinced myself it had been some cruel prank. By breakfast, it almost felt ridiculous. Old people imagine things. Memory plays tricks. Maybe she'd said another name. Maybe I dreamed it. I spent the morning repairing a loose fence board while Eleanor baked cinnamon bread. By lunchtime, the fear had faded. That night, we laughed while watching an old black and white movie. Everything felt normal again, until exactly 2:17 a.m. Ring, ring, ring. This time Eleanor sat upright before I did. The phone. "I know." I answered. Again, silence. Then the same whisper. "He was innocent, Thomas." Click. Nothing else. No breathing. No explanation. Just those 4 words. For the next 6 nights, the same thing happened. Exactly 2:17 a.m. Never early. Never late. Always the same voice. Always the same 4 words. "He was innocent, Thomas." Nothing more. No matter what I asked. "Who are you? What do you want?" Stop calling. Only silence. Then those words. Then the click. By the second week, Eleanor stopped pretending everything was fine. She watched me closely. I wasn't eating. I jumped whenever the phone rang during the day. I began locking doors before sunset. One afternoon, she placed 2 cups of tea on the porch. "Tell me?" I already did. "No." She reached across the table and held my weathered hand. "I've been married to you for 52 years. You cannot hide fear from me." I looked away. The maple leaves drifted across the yard. Finally, I whispered, "Someone keeps calling." "I know. They know my name." "What do they say?" I hesitated. "They say—" I swallowed hard. "He was innocent, Thomas." She frowned. "Innocent?" I nodded. "Doesn't mean anything?" "No. At least, that's what I wanted to believe." That evening, I climbed into the attic. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight. Boxes covered every corner. Old Christmas ornaments, military medals, our wedding photographs, letters from relatives long gone. I wasn't searching for anything in particular, just something, anything, because somewhere deep inside me, those 4 words had awakened a memory I had spent decades trying not to remember. A courthouse. Rain. Someone shouting. A young woman crying. Then nothing. The memory vanished before I could grasp it. That night, Eleanor found me sitting alone on the porch. You remembered something. Maybe. What? I don't know. She wrapped a blanket around my shoulders. We'll figure out. I smiled weakly. I hope there isn't anything to figure out. But even as I said the words, I knew I was lying. The following afternoon, our neighbor Harold stopped by. You two all right? Of course, Eleanor answered quickly. You look exhausted. I haven't been sleeping much. You should unplug that old phone. I forced a laugh. Maybe. Harold shrugged. Well, if you need anything. He tipped his hat and drove away. I watched his truck disappear. For the first time in years. Our little farmhouse didn't feel safe. That night, we decided not to sleep. We sat together in the living room. A lamp glowed beside us. The grandfather clock ticked loudly. 2:10, 2:12, 2:15. Neither of us spoke. Then, 2:17 a.m. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. I answered immediately. Who are you? Silence. Then, the same voice. Only this time, she sounded as though she were crying. He was innocent, Thomas. A pause. Then, for the first time, she added one more sentence. The letter will tell you everything. Click. The line went dead. Eleanor stared at me. What letter? I couldn't answer, because I had no idea. But somewhere inside our old house, a secret had been waiting for decades, and it had just begun calling us home. The house felt different after the woman's final words. The letter will tell you everything. Those words echoed in my mind long after the phone fell silent. Eleanor and I didn't return to bed. Instead, we sat at the kitchen table until sunrise, each holding a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. What letter? Eleanor finally asked. I honestly don't know. She studied my face. You remembered something, haven't you? I looked out the window at the first light creeping over the apple orchard. Only fragments. Tell me. I remember a rainy day, a courthouse, someone crying, and a young man being led away in handcuffs. Who was he? I can't see his face. The memory disappeared as quickly as it had come. That morning, Eleanor made a decision. If there's a letter in this house, we're going to find it. Our farmhouse had been in my family for nearly 80 years. Every room held boxes of old photographs, letters, newspapers, and forgotten keepsakes. We started in the attic. Dust covered everything. We opened one box after another. Old tax records, Christmas cards, my father's army uniform, our wedding album. Nothing. By noon, both of us were exhausted. Eleanor wiped the dust from an old framed photograph resting against a wooden trunk. It was our wedding picture. I was 26. She was 24. We looked fearless. I haven't seen this in years, she smiled. As she cleaned the glass, something caught her eye. Thomas. What is it? The back looks thicker than it should. She carefully removed the paper backing from frame. A folded yellow envelope slipped onto the floor. Neither of us moved. For several seconds, we simply stared at it. My heart began pounding. The letter, Eleanor whispered. The envelope was sealed with faded red wax. Across the front, in handwriting I hadn't seen in decades, were 6 words. For Thomas, open only when truth matters more than peace. My hands trembled. I know this writing. You do. I nodded slowly. It belongs to Margaret. Eleanor frowned. Margaret, my younger sister. She had died 43 years earlier in a car accident. At least, that was what I'd always believed. I carefully broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter. The ink had faded but remained readable. Dear Thomas, if you are reading this, then someone has finally forced the truth into the light. You believed our father. You believed the sheriff. You believed the judge. But they were all wrong. Daniel was innocent. He never started the fire. He tried to save them. Father destroyed the evidence because the truth would have ruined our family forever. I kept copies of everything. Forgive me for staying silent. One day, someone will come looking for the rest. Don't trust anyone who already knows your name. Margaret, I couldn't breathe. Daniel, the name hit me like lightning. Memories exploded inside my head. A young man, laughing, working beside me in my father's workshop, my best friend. Then, the fire, the old mill burning through the night, 3 people dead, Daniel arrested before sunrise. Everyone said he had done it for revenge after losing his job. I had believed them. I had even testified that he had argued with my father days before the fire. My words had helped convict him. Oh, God, I whispered. Eleanor looked at me in horror. You knew him. I sent an innocent man to prison. The room spun. I lowered myself into a chair. For more than 50 years, I had lived believing justice had been served. Now everything was collapsing. What copies? Eleanor asked. The letter says Margaret kept copies. But where? Before I could answer, the old grandfather clock chimed. 3 o'clock. Its sound startled both of us. Behind the chime came another noise. A creak. Upstairs. We froze. Did you hear that? Eleanor whispered. I nodded. Someone was walking across the 2nd floor. Slow, heavy footsteps. Our house should have been empty. I grabbed the fireplace poker. Eleanor, stay here. I'm not letting you go alone. Together we climbed the stairs. Each step groaned beneath our feet. The hallway was silent. The guest room door stood half open. It had been closed that morning. I pushed it open. No one. The window, however, was wide open. Cold wind blew the curtains into the room. On the floor lay muddy footprints. Someone had been inside, and they had left only moments earlier. I rushed outside. The yard was empty. The road stretched for miles without another person in sight. By the time I returned, Eleanor was staring at the photograph frame. Thomas. There was someone upstairs. Look. She pointed inside the empty frame. Taped beneath the wooden backing was a tiny brass key. I carefully removed it. Attached was a paper tag. Safe Deposit Box 214. Maple Creek Community Bank. My stomach tightened. Margaret hid more than a letter. That evening neither of us spoke much. The hidden key rested on the kitchen table between us. Outside, rain began falling. The same kind of rain I remember from that terrible night decades earlier. At exactly 2:17 a.m., the telephone rang again. This time, I answered before the first ring had finished. I found the letter. Silence. Then the familiar voice. Soft, shaking. You are running out of time. Who are you? Another pause. The people who buried the truth know you've started digging. My blood ran cold. What people? They're watching your house. I rushed to the front window. Across the road, just beyond the trees, a pair of headlights disappeared into the darkness. Someone had been sitting there, watching us. When I returned to the phone, the woman spoke one final sentence. Open the safe deposit box before they do. Click. The line went dead. Eleanor stood beside me, her face pale. Without saying a word, we both looked at the small brass key. For the first time, we realized this wasn't just about the past anymore. Someone in the present was willing to do anything to keep that past buried. And by opening one hidden letter, we had unknowingly stepped into a danger that had been waiting for more than half a century. Sleep never came. After the mysterious caller warned us that someone was watching our house, Eleanor and I sat in silence until dawn. Every passing car made us glance toward the window. Every creak of the old farmhouse sounded like footsteps. At 7 o'clock, I picked up the brass key Margaret had hidden behind our wedding photograph. Let's go, I said. Eleanor nodded. The sooner we learn the truth, the sooner this nightmare ends. Neither of us knew we were wrong. The nightmare was only beginning. The Maple Creek Community Bank had stood on the corner of Main Street for nearly a century. Its stone walls looked unchanged from the days when my father had walked through its doors. The young receptionist smiled politely. How can I help you? I placed a small brass key on the counter. I believe my late sister rented a safe deposit box here many years ago. She examined the number, box 214. After checking her computer, her smile faded. Please wait here. She disappeared into the manager's office. A few minutes later, an elderly man in a navy suit approached us. I'm Richard Collins, the bank manager. He looked at the key, then at me. You must be Thomas Bennett. A chill ran through me. How do you know my name? He hesitated. Because your sister left written instructions. He opened a worn file and carefully unfolded a yellow document. It says that if anyone ever came with this key, we would have verified that the person was Thomas Bennett, and then hand over everything inside box 214. My throat tightened, so she knew I'd come. It appears she expected this day. Richard led us downstairs into the bank vault. Rows of steel boxes lined the walls. He unlocked box 214, stepped back respectfully, and left us alone. Inside were only 3 items: a thick brown envelope, a small leather journal, and an old cassette tape labeled in faded ink. The truth, do not destroy. Eleanor looked at me. Which one first? I reached for the envelope. Inside were dozens of newspaper clippings from 1974. Every headline told the same story. Local man convicted of mill fire. 3 dead in tragic arson. Daniel Reed sentenced to life. There were also copies of police reports. One page had several sentences circled in red. A witness had claimed to see another man leaving the mill moments before the fire. But beside the statement, someone had stamped one word in bold black ink: disregarded. Another report described burned electrical wiring discovered inside the building. The official conclusion called it accidental damage after the fire. Margaret had written in the margin, "The wiring caused the fire, not Daniel." I felt sick. So the investigators knew. Eleanor whispered. Someone did. Next, I opened the leather journal. Every page belonged to Margaret. She had written almost daily during the investigation. One entry stopped me cold. June 18th, 1974. Father met secretly with Sheriff Wallace tonight. I heard Father say these exact words: "If the town learns the mill failed because of my neglect, we're finished. Daniel has no family. He'll take the blame." I closed the journal. No. Tears filled my eyes. My own father. Eleanor gently placed her hand over mine. "You didn't know." I testified against an innocent man because I trusted my father. The guilt I had buried for 50 years came crashing down. Only the cassette tape remained. Richard allowed us to use an old tape recorder kept in the manager's office. The tape hissed. Then a man's voice filled the room. I recognized it instantly. My father's voice. The recording was shaky, as though someone had secretly placed a recorder nearby. "No one can ever know," my father said. Another voice answered. "Sheriff Wallace. The evidence?" I burned what remained. "And the witness? They'll change their story. What about Thomas? He believes whatever I tell him." My heart stopped. Then came the final sentence. "If Daniel dies in prison, the truth dies with him." The recording ended. The room fell silent. Richard slowly removed the cassette. "I've worked here 30 years, he said quietly. "I had no idea this existed." Neither did I. As we stepped outside the bank, a black SUV was parked across the street. Its windows were too dark to see inside. The engine started the moment we reached our car. "It wasn't there before," Eleanor whispered. I nodded. "Get in." The SUV pulled away slowly, following us as we drove through town. Every turn we made, it made. When I accelerated, it accelerated. "They're following us," Eleanor said. Instead of driving home, I turned toward the sheriff's office. The SUV suddenly stopped at the next intersection. Seconds later, it turned around and disappeared. Whoever was inside didn't want to be seen near the police station. Inside the sheriff's office, the walls displayed photographs of every sheriff who had served Maple Creek. One picture caught my eye immediately. Sheriff Wallace, standing proudly beside my father. The current sheriff, Michael Dawson, welcomed us into his office. He listened carefully as we explained everything: the phone calls, the hidden letter, the journal, and the recording. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. "I've heard rumors about the mill fire my entire career," he admitted. "But rumors aren't evidence." I handed him the cassette. "And now," he stared at it for a long moment. "This changes everything." Just then his office phone rang. He answered. His expression changed instantly. "What?" He stood. "When?" He slowly hung up. "What happened?" Eleanor asked. Sheriff Dawson looked directly at me. Someone broke into your farmhouse. My stomach dropped. We just left. The caller reported seeing two people force open your back door. We raced outside. By the time we reached our house, two patrol cars were already there. The back door hung from its broken hinges. Every drawer had been emptied. Every cabinet opened. Books lay scattered across the floor. Family photographs had been ripped from the walls. But something felt strange. The thieves hadn't taken our television. They hadn't touched the silverware. They ignored the cash Eleanor kept in the kitchen drawer. They had searched for only one thing: the evidence. As I stood in the middle of the wrecked living room, my eyes fell on the hallway table. The telephone. At exactly 2:17 p.m., it began to ring. I answered. The familiar woman's voice whispered urgently, "They know you found the truth." I gripped the receiver. "Who are you?" For the first time, she answered, "My name is—" The line suddenly filled with loud static. Then another voice, a man's, cut in, cold, threatening. "You should have left the past buried." The call ended. Eleanor looked at me, terrified. Whoever had framed Daniel Reed 50 years ago was gone. But someone else had inherited their secrets, and now they were willing to destroy anyone who tried to uncover them. The silence after the phone call felt heavier than the wreckage around us. Our living room looked as though a storm had torn through it. Drawers were overturned. Family albums lay scattered across the floor, and broken picture frames crunched beneath our shoes. But whoever had broken into our home hadn't come to steal. They had come to erase the truth. Sheriff Michael Dawson slowly walked through the house, examining every room. They knew exactly what they were looking for, he said, but they didn't find it. I looked at the cassette tape, Margaret's journal, and the envelope locked inside the sheriff's evidence case. "No," I answered quietly. They were too late. That evening, Sheriff Dawson assigned a patrol car to drive past our farmhouse every few hours. "It isn't full protection," he admitted. "But until we know who's behind this, I don't want you two alone." Eleanor thanked him, but I could see the worry in her eyes. Our peaceful home no longer felt like home. After dinner, neither of us touched the television. We simply sat together on the porch, watching the sun disappear behind apple trees. "Do you regret opening that letter?" Eleanor asked. I thought for a long moment. If Daniel truly was innocent, I stared toward the darkening orchard. Then I regret waiting 52 years. At exactly 2:17 a.m., the phone rang again. This time, I answered before the second ring. "Please," I said, "no more riddles." For several seconds, only breathing. Then the familiar woman's voice. "They're listening." "Who are you?" "You already know my name." "I don't." A pause. "My father called me Grace." The name meant nothing to me. "I'm sorry," I said. "I don't remember." "You wouldn't." Her voice trembled. "I was only 6 years old when they took him away." A cold wave swept through my body. "Your father was Daniel Reed." I couldn't speak. For more than 50 years, I had believed Daniel had no family. I had been wrong. "I've spent my entire life proving my father didn't murder anyone," Grace whispered. "My mother died waiting for someone to believe him." Tears filled Eleanor's eyes. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, though Grace couldn't hear her. "I found Margaret's letters after she passed away," Grace continued. "She wanted to tell the truth, but she became frightened. Why didn't you come to us?" "I tried." "When?" 30 years ago." I searched my memory. Nothing. My letters were returned unopened. I slowly lowered my head. Years earlier, after Eleanor and I had moved to farmhouse, I had told the post office to reject mail from anyone connected to the old mill tragedy. I had wanted to bury the past forever. Without realizing it, I had rejected Grace's desperate attempts to reach me. "Where are you now?" I asked. "I can't tell you." "Why?" "Because they're watching me, too." Before I could ask another question, she spoke quickly. "They're not protecting your father's reputation anymore." "Then what are they protecting?" "The land." "The land?" "Everything started because of what was buried beneath the old mill." Click. The line went dead. The next morning, Sheriff Dawson listened carefully. The land, he repeated. That's what she said. He leaned back in his chair. Interesting. He pulled an old county map from a cabinet. The mill burned in 1974. He placed his finger on a faded section of land. 20 years later, this property was quietly purchased by a company called Black Ridge Development. I've never heard of them. Most people haven't. He flipped through another folder. Because they no longer exist. Who owns the land now? Dawson's expression darkened. Sterling Industries. The name hit me immediately. Sterling Industries wasn't some small company. It was the largest employer in the county. Its chairman, Victor Sterling, was one of the wealthiest men in the state. What does a corporation want with an abandoned mill? Eleanor asked. That's exactly what I'd like to know. Later that afternoon, Dawson received permission to reopen the mill investigation. The old building had been demolished decades ago, but the land remained fenced off. A forensic excavation team agreed to begin digging the following morning. News traveled quickly through Maple Creek. By evening, everyone knew the old case had been reopened. So did the people trying to stop us. At 8:43 p.m., someone knocked on our front door. 3 sharp knocks. I opened it cautiously. A young delivery driver stood outside, holding a small package. No return address, he said. I was paid cash. Inside the package was an old silver pocket watch. I recognized it instantly. It had belonged to Daniel Reed. Folded beneath the watch was a typed note. Stop digging. This is your last warning. No signature. No fingerprints. Nothing. Sheriff Dawson immediately sent the package to the crime lab. They're becoming desperate, he said. That's good. It doesn't feel good. It means we're getting close. The following morning, the excavation began. Television crews gathered outside the fenced property. Workers carefully removed decades of dirt. Hour after hour passed. Nothing. By late afternoon, many people assumed the search had failed. Then one of the workers shouted, "We found something." Everyone rushed forward. A rusted steel container slowly emerged from beneath the soil. It had been buried nearly 50 years. Sheriff Dawson carefully opened it. Inside were stacks of weather-damaged documents, old engineering reports, financial records, and one leather-bound ledger. The front cover read, "Mill Safety Inspection, Confidential." An engineer's signature appeared at the bottom. The report had been completed 3 weeks before the fire. Its conclusion was devastating. Warning: electrical system failure is imminent. Immediate repairs required. Continued operation could result in catastrophic fire. My father's signature appeared beneath the warning. Instead of approving repairs, he had written 2 words. Too expensive. Eleanor covered her mouth. Oh, Thomas. 3 innocent people had died because repairs cost too much. Daniel Reed hadn't started the fire. He had become the perfect scapegoat. As reporters surrounded the excavation site, Sheriff Dawson carefully lifted the ledger into an evidence bag. "This," he said quietly, "is enough to reopen everything." Just then, a deafening gunshot echoed across the field. The evidence bag flew from Dawson's hand. A bullet had torn straight through it. People screamed and dropped to the ground. Another shot rang out. The sniper wasn't trying to scare us anymore. The second gunshot sent everyone diving for cover. Reporters threw themselves behind their news vans. Deputies pulled civilians to ground. Eleanor grabbed my arm and dragged me behind a pile of concrete from the old mill foundation. "Thomas," she cried, "stay down." Sheriff Michael Dawson drew his service weapon and shouted, "Everyone behind, cover! Find the shooter." For several terrifying seconds, the only sounds were frightened voices and the wail of police sirens rushing toward the abandoned mill. Then, silence. The sniper was gone. Within minutes, officers searched the surrounding woods. Nearly an hour later, they found an empty firing position on a nearby hillside. The rifle had been abandoned, so it had a backpack containing gloves, bottled water, and a map of the excavation site. But there were no fingerprints, no DNA. Whoever had planned the attack knew exactly what they were doing. Back at the mill, Sheriff Dawson carefully inspected the damaged evidence bag. The bullet had torn through the leather ledger, but it hadn't destroyed it. Most of the pages remained readable. He smiled for the first time in days. They failed. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. The truth had survived. Again, that evening, Eleanor and I returned home under police escort. 2 patrol cars remained outside our farmhouse. For the first time since the nightmare had begun, armed deputies stood watch through the night. Still, none of us slept. At exactly 2:17 a.m., the telephone rang. I answered immediately. Grace. Yes. Her voice sounded calmer than before. I saw the news. They tried to destroy the evidence. I know. Who are these people? There was a long pause. Then she whispered, My father told me one name before he died. My heart stopped. He said, Never trust Victor Sterling. I looked at Eleanor. Victor Sterling, the owner of Sterling Industries, the man whose company now controlled the old mill property. Are you certain? My father repeated that name every time I visited him in prison. He said Victor's father helped cover up the fire. Everything suddenly made sense. Sheriff Wallace, my father, Victor Sterling's father, 3 powerful men, 1 terrible secret. The next morning, Sheriff Dawson requested financial records from Sterling Industries. By noon, investigators discovered something shocking. Just 6 months after the mill fire, Victor Sterling's father had quietly purchased the burned property for almost nothing. 20 years later, geological surveys revealed enormous deposits of rare industrial minerals beneath the land. The property was now worth hundreds of millions of dollars. If the public had learned the fire resulted from criminal negligence instead of arson, the lawsuits would have bankrupted everyone involved. So they blamed Daniel Reed, an innocent mechanic with no powerful family. The perfect sacrifice. That afternoon, Dawson called us to the courthouse. The district attorney wants to hear the recording. We entered a conference room filled with investigators, prosecutors, and state police officials. The cassette tape played once more. My father's voice echoed through the room. If Daniel dies in prison, the truth dies with him. When it ended, nobody spoke. The district attorney finally broke the silence. This is enough. He authorized a criminal investigation into decades of fraud, conspiracy, evidence tampering, and wrongful conviction. Even though the original conspirators were dead, anyone who had continued to cover up could still face prosecution. News spread across the country. Television stations replayed the story every hour. People demanded justice for Daniel Reed. Historians reopened the case. Former mill workers came forward with stories they had been too frightened to tell decades earlier. One elderly electrician admitted he had personally warned my father that the wiring would fail. Another confessed he had accepted money to stay silent. The wall of lies was finally collapsing. Late that evening, there was another knock at our door. Sheriff Dawson stood outside. Beside him was a woman in her late 50s. Gray streaks ran through her dark hair. Her eyes were red from crying. For a moment, none of us moved. Then she spoke. My name is Grace Reed. The voice. It was the same voice from every phone call. I stared at her, unable to find words. She stepped forward. You don't recognize me. I slowly shook my head. You carried me once. What? I was 6 years old. She smiled through tears. My father brought me to your house before his arrest. A memory flashed through my mind. A little girl sitting on our porch swing, holding a rag doll, laughing. I had forgotten. She hadn't. I never hated you, Grace said softly. I hated the lies. Tears streamed down my face. I'm sorry. I know. No, you don't. I could barely speak. I stood in court and helped send your father to prison. You were deceived. I should have asked questions. You trusted your father, and because of that, my voice broke. Your father lost his life. Grace stepped forward and embraced me. For several seconds, neither of us said a word. 2 families had carried the same burden for more than 50 years. At last, the silence ended. As Grace prepared to leave, she handed me one final envelope. My father asked me to give you this if the truth ever came out. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single handwritten page. Thomas, if you're reading this, then you finally know I didn't start the fire. I never blamed you. Good men can be fooled by people they love. Don't spend the rest of your life punishing yourself. Spend it helping the truth live longer than the lie. That's all I've ever wanted. Your friend, Daniel. I could no longer hold back my tears. For 52 years, I had lived with a lie. Now, an innocent man's final words had given me something I never believed I deserved: forgiveness. But Sheriff Dawson's phone rang before anyone could speak. He answered, listened silently, and looked at us. "They've issued an arrest warrant," he said, "for Victor Sterling." The truth had finally reached a man who had spent decades protecting it. And tomorrow, the entire world would be watching. The next morning, Maple Creek had never looked so crowded. News vans lined both sides of Main Street. Reporters stood outside the courthouse. Cameras pointed toward the entrance. People who had ignored the old mill fire for half a century now wanted answers. Eleanor squeezed my hand as we stepped from Sheriff Dawson's car. "Are you ready?" she asked softly. I looked at the courthouse where, 52 years earlier, I had unknowingly helped convict my best friend. "No," I admitted, "but it's time." Victor Sterling arrived surrounded by attorneys. At 74, he still carried himself like a man who believed money could solve every problem. The moment he saw me, his expression hardened. "So," he said coldly, "you're the old man who couldn't leave the past alone." I met his eyes. The past never left us. His smile disappeared. Inside the courtroom, every seat was filled. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The prosecutor stood and began laying out the evidence: Margaret's hidden letter, the journal, the engineering report warning that the mill's electrical system was dangerously unsafe, the secretly recorded cassette of my father and Sheriff Wallace discussing the cover-up, financial records showing how the burned property had been acquired for almost nothing before becoming worth hundreds of millions of dollars. One by one, the pieces fit together. For the first time in more than 50 years, the official story collapsed. Victor Sterling's attorney stood. "My client was a child when the fire occurred. He cannot be held responsible for decisions made by his father." The prosecutor nodded. That would be true if he hadn't spent the last 30 years destroying evidence, threatening witnesses, and attempting to silence anyone reopening the investigation. The courtroom grew quiet. Then Sheriff Dawson testified about the break-in at our farmhouse, the threatening phone call, the sniper attack at the excavation site, the anonymous warning note. Investigators had traced payments made to a private security contractor hired through shell companies connected to Sterling Industries. Victor Sterling's face turned pale. Then the prosecutor called me. I slowly walked to the witness stand. At 78, every step felt heavier than the last. After taking the oath, I looked around the courtroom. "I have something to say." I began. "My name is Thomas Bennett. My father taught me that a man's word was his honor. I believed him. When he told me Daniel Reed had started that fire, I never questioned him. I testified against the best friend I ever had. My testimony helped send an innocent man to prison." The courtroom remained silent. I've carried that guilt every single day for 52 years. I looked toward Grace Reed, who sat quietly in the front row. My greatest shame isn't that I was fooled. My greatest shame is that I stopped asking questions. Tears filled my eyes. I cannot give Daniel back the years he lost. I cannot return him to his daughter, but I can finally tell the truth. And if my words help clear his name, then perhaps an old man can leave this world with a little less regret. Not a single person spoke. Several jurors quietly wiped away tears. Grace was called next. She carried only one piece of evidence: a faded photograph. It showed Daniel Reed standing beside me outside the old mill, both of us smiling with our sleeves rolled up after a day's work. "My father kept this photograph until the day he died," Grace said. "He told me, Thomas isn't my enemy. Lies are." The courtroom became so quiet that even the sound of someone crying in the gallery could be heard. 3 weeks later, the investigation reached its conclusion. Victor Sterling was indicted on multiple charges, including conspiracy, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and arranging violent attacks to conceal decades-old crimes. Several former executives agreed to testify against him in exchange for reduced sentences. The cover-up that had survived for more than half a century finally came apart. One crisp autumn afternoon, the state officially overturned Daniel Reed's conviction. The governor issued a formal declaration stating that Daniel Reed had been wrongfully convicted and was completely innocent. For Grace, it was a moment she had waited for her entire life. For me, it was both a beginning and an ending. A week later, the town gathered at the old mill site. The burned ruins were gone. In their place stood a small memorial of polished granite. Carved into the stone were the names of the 3 victims who died in the fire. Beneath them, another inscription read, Daniel Reed, a good man wrongfully condemned. May truth always outlive fear. Grace placed white roses at the memorial. Eleanor laid a small bouquet of wildflowers beside them. I stood quietly for a long time. Then I whispered the words I should have spoken decades earlier. I'm sorry, my friend. A gentle breeze swept across the field. For the first time in years, the weight on my heart felt lighter. Life slowly returned to normal. The mysterious phone call stopped. Every night, the clock still struck 2:17 a.m. But now, the telephone remained silent. Instead of fear, the silence brought peace. One evening, Eleanor and I sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the orchard in shades of gold. She rested her head on my shoulder. Do you think Daniel forgave you? She asked. I smiled as I remembered his final letter. I know he did. She reached for my hand. You once told me that every house keeps its secrets. I nodded. I was wrong. How so? Houses don't keep secrets. People do. And eventually, I looked across the quiet fields where the old mill had once stood. The truth always finds its way home. The grandfather clock inside the farmhouse began to chime. Its familiar rhythm filled the evening air. This time, it didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like peace.